Commander Zarathul had never expected to crash land on a primitive world. Her sleek silver vessel, pride of the Vextai Empire, now lay twisted among the alien trees like a broken bird. Purple blood seeped from cuts across her scaled arms, but worse than the pain was the damage to her wings. The magnificent gossamer membranes that marked her as royalty hung in tatters. Without them, she was nothing. A queen who could not fly was no queen at all. Her people would cast her out, strip her of title and honor. Death would be kinder. Through the cracked viewport, she watched a strange bipedal creature approach her wreckage. It walked upright on two legs, covered in some kind of artificial skin. The database called them humans, a barely evolved species that had only recently discovered fire, or so the reports claimed. They were supposed to be violent, aggressive, constantly warring among themselves. This one carried no visible weapons, though. It moved slowly, hands visible and empty. When it saw her through the damaged hull, it stopped completely. She expected it to run or attack. Instead, it tilted its head and made soft sounds. "Hey there," the human said, though she didn't understand the primitive language. "You look hurt. I'm going to help you, okay?" Zarathul hissed a warning, her secondary arms spreading wide in a threat display. The human stepped back, but didn't flee. It held up its hands in what seemed like a peaceful gesture. Then, it did something unexpected. It sat down in the dirt, making itself smaller, less threatening. The human pointed to itself. "Jack," it said clearly. Then, it pointed to her. The meaning was obvious. It was trying to establish communication. She had studied enough primitive cultures to recognize the attempt. "Zarathul," she responded reluctantly, touching her chest with one of her forearms. Jack smiled, showing its flat white teeth. Among her people, such a display would be threatening, but somehow this felt different. The human stood slowly and moved to the edge of her ship's wreckage. It examined the twisted metal, then looked back at her with something that might have been concern. "Hurt?" Jack asked, miming pain by clutching his side. Then, he pointed at her wings. Zarathul's primary heart sank. Even this primitive creature could see her shame. She turned away, but Jack made more soft noises. When she looked back, he was pulling items from a container on his back. Medical supplies, she realized. Primitive, but clearly intended for healing. The human set the supplies down and backed away, giving her space. Then he sat down again and waited. The gesture confused her. Among the starfaring races she knew, the strong dominated the weak. This human should either worship her as a superior being or try to capture her for study. Instead, it offered help without demanding anything in return. Pain lanced through her wing as she shifted position. The damage was severe. Several of the delicate support structures were broken, and the membrane itself had multiple tears. On her homeworld, the royal physicians would have expensive nano-repair technology. Here, she had nothing. Jack seemed to notice her distress. He pointed to his supplies again, then to her wings. His expression was patient, almost gentle. After a long moment, Zarathul made a decision that went against everything she'd been taught about inferior species. She nodded. Jack approached carefully, stopping when she tensed. He held up a small bottle and cloth, showing them to her, before making gentle cleaning motions. Understanding flooded through her. He was asking permission to tend her wounds. No one had ever asked her permission for anything. As Empress of 3-star systems, others begged for her attention, but no one cared about her comfort. This strange human seemed more concerned with her well-being than her own royal physicians. "Careful," she whispered in her own language, though she knew he couldn't understand. Jack's hands were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the cuts on her arms. His touch was warm, warmer than any Vextai. When he moved to examine her wings, she instinctively pulled them closer to her body. "It's okay," Jack said softly. "I won't hurt you." Something in his tone transcended language barriers. Slowly, painfully, she extended one damaged wing. Jack's eyes widened as he took in the full extent of the injury. She waited for him to recoil in disgust or declare her beyond help. Instead, he looked thoughtful. He examined the wing structure with careful eyes, tracing the damage without touching. Then, he looked at her and nodded firmly, as if making a promise. The human disappeared into the forest for several minutes, leaving Zarathul alone with her doubts. Perhaps she had misjudged him. Perhaps he had gone to fetch others of his kind to capture her. She tried to activate her ship's emergency beacon, but the communications array was completely destroyed. When Jack returned, he carried an armload of plant materials and what looked like thin strips of some local wood. He also had a small electronic device that he'd clearly salvaged from somewhere. As he began sorting his materials, Zarathul realized he was preparing to attempt actual repairs. "You think you can fix them?" she asked in Standard Galactic, knowing he wouldn't understand but needing to voice the question. Jack looked up at the sound and seemed to understand her meaning, if not her words. He held up his hands, measuring distances between his fingers, then pointed to the tears in her wing membrane. His expression was determined. For the first time since the crash, Zarathul felt something other than despair. This primitive human, who should barely understand fire, was attempting to heal injuries that challenged even advanced medical technology. Either he was incredibly foolish or incredibly brave. As Jack began his work, Zarathul found herself studying him with new eyes. His movements were careful and precise. His face showed intense concentration, as if her well-being was the most important thing in his universe. When he occasionally met her gaze, she saw no fear, no desire to possess or control her. She saw only kindness. The concept was so alien to her experience that she didn't have words for it in her own language. In a Vextai empire, everything was transaction, domination, or submission. Kindness without purpose was not just unknown. It was impossible. Yet here was this human, working for hours to help someone he'd never met, expecting nothing in return. As darkness fell, and Jack continued his delicate work by the light of a small fire, Zarathul began to suspect that her people's assessment of humans might be dangerously incomplete. Jack worked through the night, his fingers moving with surprising skill across the delicate wing membrane. He had fashioned tiny needles from thorns and thread from plant fibers, creating tools that shouldn't have been possible with such primitive materials. Zarathul watched in fascination as he carefully stitched the tears, his movements precise despite the crude implements. "Where did you learn this?" she murmured in her own language, though she knew he couldn't answer. Jack paused and looked at her. He seemed to sense her question, even if he couldn't understand the words. He held up his hands and mimed working with delicate objects, then pointed to the sky. After a moment of confusion, Zarathul understood. He was trying to tell her about his profession. From his pack, Jack pulled out a small photograph. It showed him standing next to what looked like a primitive flying machine, but one with incredible detail and craftsmanship. He was some kind of engineer or craftsman, specializing in things that flew. That explained his careful attention to her wing structure. As the hours passed, Zarathul found herself relaxing despite the pain. Jack's presence was oddly comforting. When she grew tired, he didn't take advantage of her vulnerability. When she showed signs of pain, he would pause and offer her water from his container. The liquid tasted strange, but helped with the burning in her throat. "You don't even know what I am," she said quietly, watching his concentrated face in the firelight. "For all you know, I could be dangerous. I could kill you the moment I'm healed." Jack looked up at the sound of her voice. He studied her face for a moment, then smiled again. That strange expression of warmth and acceptance. He seemed to understand that she was trying to communicate something important. "Good," he said simply, pointing to her and nodding. Then he pointed to himself. "Good." The word meant nothing to her linguistically, but his meaning was clear. He believed she was good. Not useful, not valuable, not powerful good. It was a moral judgment that went beyond any practical consideration. Among her own people, goodness was a luxury that only the strong could afford, and, even then, only when it served their interests. Jack returned to his work, carefully applying a thin coating of tree sap to reinforce the stitches. The substance seemed to have healing properties. The constant ache in her wings began to subside slightly. When he finished with the membrane repairs, he turned his attention to the broken support structures. This was the more challenging work. The wing bones were hollow and delicate, designed for flight rather than strength. Several had clean breaks, while others had stress fractures that would never heal properly without intervention. Jack examined each damaged strut with the intensity of a master craftsman studying a complex puzzle. From his salvaged materials, he began constructing tiny splints. He used the thin wood strips, carved down to impossibly precise measurements. Each splint was custom-fitted to the specific bone it would support. The work required not just skill, but an intuitive understanding of how the wing structure functioned. Impossible d'être whispered. Her own people would have needed advanced scanning equipment and computer-guided surgical tools to attempt such repairs. Jack was doing it with his eyes, his hands, and materials he'd gathered from the forest floor. As dawn approached, Jack finally sat back to examine his work. Both wings now showed signs of extensive repair. Neat lines of stitching across the membranes, carefully positioned splints along the support bones, and a coating of natural healing compounds over the entire surface. The work was crude compared to high-tech medical intervention, but it was also strangely beautiful in its simplicity. Jack looked exhausted. His eyes were red from the smoke and strain, and his hands shook slightly from hours of delicate work. But when he met Zarathol's gaze, he seemed pleased with what he'd accomplished. "Try," he said, making a gentle flapping motion with his hands. Zarathol hesitated. The fear of further damage was overwhelming, but so was the need to know if Jack's efforts had succeeded. Slowly, carefully, she extended one wing. Pain shot through the damaged areas, but it was different now. The sharp agony of torn tissue had been replaced by the duller ache of healing. The wing held. The membranes stretched without tearing, and the support structure bore the weight without collapsing. It wasn't perfect. She could feel the weakness where the repairs had been made, but it was functional. Tears began flowing down her scaled cheeks, a response that seemed to alarm Jack. He reached toward her face, then stopped, unsure if such contact would be welcome. Zarathol caught his hand in two of her own and pressed it gently to her cheek, letting him feel the moisture there. "Thank you," she said in Standard Galactic, putting all the emotion she could manage into the words. Jack might not have understood the language, but he understood the meaning. His tired face lit up with genuine joy, as if her healing brought him more happiness than it brought her. They sat together in the growing daylight, both exhausted from the long night's work. Jack shared his food with her, simple preserved items that tasted better than any royal feast she'd ever attended. When he offered her his jacket, as the morning air grew cold, she accepted it gratefully. "I need to tell you something," Zarathol said, knowing he couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "I'm not just any Vextai. I am their empress. I command fleets that could destroy your world without effort. My people would consider you nothing more than an intelligent animal." Jack listened to her words with patient attention, even though they meant nothing to him. When she finished, he simply nodded and patted her shoulder gently. "But you saw something in me that my own people never have," she continued. "You saw someone worth saving, not because of what I could do for you, but simply because I was hurt and needed help. That is something that doesn't exist in my world." As the sun climbed higher, Zarathol began to understand that this encounter would change everything. She had seen humanity at its most basic level, and what she'd found challenged every assumption her civilization held about primitive species. Jack had shown her something that her advanced, powerful people had forgotten in their climb to dominance: compassion without agenda, help without expectation of reward, kindness for its own sake. The question that now burned in her mind was whether such a revelation could somehow bridge the vast gulf between their civilizations, or if it was simply a beautiful anomaly in an indifferent universe. 3 days passed in the forest clearing, and Zarathol's wings grew stronger with each passing hour. Jack had fashioned a shelter from the wreckage of her ship and materials from the forest, creating a space where she could rest while her body healed. He brought her food, water, and medicinal plants, never asking for anything in return. During their time together, they developed a basic form of communication. Jack was remarkably quick at picking up simple words in her language, while she began to understand his gestures and basic English phrases. Their conversations were limited, but somehow they managed to share ideas that went far beyond words. "Why?" Zarathol asked on the third evening, using the English word Jack had taught her. She pointed to herself, then to him, then made a questioning gesture. Why help her? Why care about a stranger from another world? Jack thought for a long moment, staring into their small campfire. Finally, he pointed to her wings, then to his own back, miming injury. He showed her pain on his face, then pointed to his chest, and made a sad expression. "Hurt," he said simply. "Help." It was the most basic explanation possible, yet it contained a profound truth. He helped because she was hurt. There was no other reason needed. In Jack's worldview, suffering demanded response, regardless of who was suffering or why. Zarathul tried to explain her own people's philosophy, using their shared vocabulary and gestures. She showed him images of strength dominating weakness, of the powerful taking what they wanted from those who couldn't resist. Jack listened carefully, but she could see confusion and something like sadness in his eyes. "No," he said finally, shaking his head. "Wrong." That single word carried more moral weight than all the philosophical treatises she'd studied in the Royal Academies. Jack's rejection of her people's way wasn't based on complex ethical arguments or political theory. It came from something deeper, an instinctive understanding that suffering was wrong and helping was right. On the fourth morning, Zarathul's ship's emergency systems finally activated. The automated distress beacon began transmitting, sending her location to any Vextai vessels in the area. She knew it wouldn't be long before a rescue ship arrived. The knowledge filled her with an unexpected mixture of relief and dread. Relief because she would soon be safe among her own people. Dread because it meant leaving Jack behind, and because she would have to face the question of what to tell her people about this world and its inhabitants. Jack seemed to sense the change in her mood. When she showed him the blinking light on her ship's console, he understood immediately that help was coming. His reaction surprised her. Instead of celebration that she would be leaving, she saw something like sadness cross his features. "You go?" he asked, pointing to the sky. "Yes," she replied in English, then added in her own language, "and I wish I didn't have to." They spent that day in quiet companionship. Jack continued to tend her wings, checking the healing progress with gentle fingers. The repairs were holding well, better than she had dared hope. She would never fly quite the same way again, but she would fly. As evening approached, Zarathul felt compelled to share something with Jack. From her ship's wreckage, she retrieved a small device, a holographic projector that had survived the crash. She activated it, showing him images of her homeworld. Jack's eyes widened as he saw the towering crystal cities, the vast fleets of starships, the millions of Vextai going about their daily lives. She showed him the imperial palace where she lived, with its soaring spires and impossible architecture. Then, she showed him images of her people's military might, weapons that could crack planets, ships that blotted out stars. "This is what I am," she said, pointing to herself, then to the images of imperial regalia and fleet formations. "This is my power." Jack studied the images carefully, but his expression remained unchanged. When she finished the display, he looked at her and smiled that warm, accepting smile she had come to treasure. "Good," he said, pointing to her. "Not powerful or impressive or frightening. Good." The simplicity of his response nearly broke her hearts. Even after seeing the vast scope of her civilization's might, Jack saw her the same way he had from the beginning, as a person who had needed help and who he was glad to have helped. That night, as they sat by their fire for what would likely be the last time, Zarathul made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. She began teaching Jack about her people, not just their power, but their weaknesses, their inability to understand cooperation without dominance, their assumption that all relationships were based on strength and submission, their conviction that compassion was a luxury that the strong could afford to show the weak, but never something to be shared between equals. "My people will come here someday," she told him, mixing her language with his in a pidgin that somehow conveyed complex ideas. "They will see your world as something to be conquered or ignored. They will not see what I have seen." Jack listened intently, asking questions when he didn't understand. Gradually, she could see him beginning to grasp the implications of what she was telling him. His people were not alone in the universe, and their eventual contact with galactic civilization would not necessarily be pleasant. "What do I do?" Jack asked, the weight of this knowledge visible in his expression. It was a question that Zarathul couldn't answer. She was one voice in a vast imperial hierarchy, and her people's attitudes toward primitive worlds were based on thousands of years of precedent. Even as empress, she couldn't simply declare humanity off-limits to exploitation or conquest. But perhaps there was another way. "I tell them about you," she said slowly, working out the idea as she spoke. "I tell them humans are not animals. I tell them you are good. Jack nodded, but she could see he understood how difficult that would be. One person's testimony against the assumptions of an entire civilization. As dawn broke on the fifth day, a shadow fell across their clearing. Zarathul looked up to see a Vextai rescue vessel descending through the clouds, its sleek black hull gleaming in the morning sun. Her people had found her. Jack stood and moved a respectful distance away, giving her space to meet her rescuers. But as the ship landed and armored figures emerged, Zarathul realized that this moment would define not just her future, but possibly the future of two entire species. The rescue team's leader approached, speaking in formal court language. Your Imperial Majesty, we are relieved to find you unharmed. The ship is prepared for immediate departure. Zarathul looked from the rescue team to Jack, who stood quietly at the edge of the clearing. In the eyes of her people, he was nothing, a primitive creature who had stumbled across their empress by accident. They couldn't see what she saw, the gentle strength, the selfless compassion, the moral clarity that her own advanced civilization had somehow lost. I was not unharmed, she said carefully. This being provided medical assistance and shelter. Without his intervention, I would have died. The rescue team leader looked at Jack with new interest, though still clearly seeing him as little more than a useful animal. Shall we eliminate the witness, Your Majesty? He asked casually. No, Zarathul said quickly, perhaps too quickly. That will not be necessary. As she walked toward the rescue ship, Zarathul made another decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. She would not just tell her people about human kindness, she would show them. And if that meant risking her crown, her position, and her life to protect a world of beings her people considered inferior, then so be it. Some things were worth more than power. The Imperial Council chamber fell silent as Zarathul finished her report. Around the massive circular table sat the most powerful beings in the Vextai Empire. Military commanders who had conquered star systems, scientists who had unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light travel, and politicians who had shaped the destinies of entire species. And they were all staring at their empress as if she had lost her mind. Let me understand this correctly, said General Vextar, his four arms crossed in obvious skepticism. You are requesting that we declare this Earth system off-limits to colonization and resource extraction based on the actions of a single primitive being? Not just off-limits, Zarathul replied, keeping her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. I'm requesting that we establish formal diplomatic contact with humanity and offer them protection under the Auxiliary Species Accords. The chamber erupted in voices, some angry, some incredulous, all expressing various degrees of disbelief. Admiral Kethare's voice cut through the noise. Your Majesty, with respect, these creatures have barely achieved atomic energy. They wage constant war on their own planet. Our xenobiological reports classify them as aggressively territorial and intellectually limited. What possible benefit could the Empire gain from such an alliance? Zarathul had expected this reaction. For 3 months since her return, she had prepared for this moment, gathering data and building arguments that might convince her people to see humanity differently. But now, facing the accumulated skepticism of the most powerful individuals in known space, those carefully crafted arguments seemed inadequate. Instead, she decided to tell them the truth. I crashed on their world broken and dying, she said, rising from her throne to address the council directly. My wings were destroyed. In our culture, that would have made me fit only for exile or execution. This human, Jack, spent an entire night repairing tissue and bone with tools he made from forest materials. He asked for nothing in return. He expected nothing in return. He helped me simply because I needed help. Science advisor Zelmoth leaned forward, her analytical mind clearly working through the implications. Empress, you describe behavior that would be classified as maladaptive by any reasonable evolutionary standard. Expending resources to aid a potential competitor or threat serves no survival purpose. Perhaps this was an anomaly, a mental defect in one individual. That's what I thought, Zarathul admitted. So I had our intelligence division conduct covert observations of human behavior across their planet. What they found challenges every assumption we've made about how intelligent species develop. She activated the holographic display at the center of the chamber, showing recordings gathered by hidden surveillance drones. The images showed humans in dozens of different situations, rescuing strangers from burning buildings, sharing food with those who had none, risking their own lives to save drowning swimmers they had never met. This is not anomalous behavior, Zarathul continued. This is systemic. Humans routinely sacrifice their own interests for the welfare of others, including complete strangers. They have entire professions dedicated to helping people they will never meet again. They donate resources to individuals they will never encounter, in places they will never visit. The council watched the images with growing confusion. Several members began speaking at once, trying to rationalize what they were seeing in terms familiar to Vextai thinking. Clearly a form of reciprocal altruism, suggested Economic Minister Darvel. They help others expecting future assistance in return. No, Zarathul replied, switching to another set of recordings. Watch this. The new images showed human emergency responders rushing toward dangerous situations, earthquake rescues, medical emergencies, natural disasters. The footage was carefully selected to show humans helping people they could never expect to meet again, in circumstances where no reciprocal benefit was possible. Perhaps it's genetic programming to protect their own species, offered genetics specialist Morina. Zarathul showed footage of humans caring for injured animals, protesting the destruction of forests they would never see, and sending aid to human populations on the other side of their planet. Group selection favoring cooperative societies, suggested another council member. More footage, humans helping members of rival nations, former enemies, people whose success might actually threaten their own interests. One by one, every rational explanation was countered by evidence. The council grew quieter as they struggled to understand behavior that made no sense in their worldview. Finally, General Vextar spoke into the silence. Even if what you say is true, Empress, how does this affect our strategic interests? A species inclined towards self-sacrifice would seem easier to conquer, not harder. Zarathul had been waiting for this question. She called up a final set of images, historical footage from humanity's own databases, showing their response to existential threats. Humans standing against impossible odds, fighting for principles rather than territory, choosing death over surrender when their core values were threatened. You're right that they sacrifice for others, she said. But what you fail to understand is what that means when they perceive you as a threat to those they protect. These beings who will die for strangers will absolutely die fighting anyone who threatens their world. She showed them footage of human resistance movements, of ordinary people becoming extraordinary when their families were threatened, of entire populations choosing to fight hopeless battles rather than submit to domination. Every military projection we've run confirms this, she continued. Humans would resist conquest with a ferocity that would make it prohibitively expensive, even for us. But, more importantly, we would be destroying something unique in the galaxy, a species that has developed advanced compassion alongside advanced intelligence. The chamber fell silent again as the council absorbed this information. Finally, science advisor Zelmoth spoke. Empress, even if we accept your assessment of human nature, you're asking us to fundamentally alter our approach to an entire species based on your interaction with one individual. The political implications alone are staggering. I'm asking you to recognize that our assumptions about how intelligence develops may be incomplete, Zarathul replied. We've encountered hundreds of species, and with each one we've followed the same pattern. Evaluate their technology, assess their resources, determine their military capacity, and then decide whether to conquer, exploit, or ignore them. We judge other species by how much they're like us. She paused, looking around the chamber at faces that had never questioned their civilization's fundamental assumptions. But what if being like us isn't the only way to be intelligent? What if there are forms of strength we've never learned to recognize? Jack saved my life not because he was strong enough to overpower me, but because he was strong enough to help someone who might have been his enemy. That's a kind of power we don't have. Admiral Kethare shook her head slowly. You're asking us to gamble our empire's expansion on philosophical speculation about alien psychology. I'm asking you to consider that maybe expansion isn't always the answer, Zarathul said quietly. Maybe sometimes we need to learn from those we encounter, instead of just conquering them. The silence that followed was different from the earlier skeptical quiet. This was the sound of an entire worldview being challenged, of assumptions that had guided galactic policy for millennia suddenly being called into question. When the council finally voted, it was closer than anyone had expected. The motion to establish formal contact with humanity passed by a margin of 3 votes out of 47. It wasn't a mandate, but it was enough. As the council members filed out of the chamber, many still shaking their heads in confusion, science advisor Zelmoth approached the throne. "Empress," she said quietly, "I hope you understand what you've just set in motion. If you're wrong about these humans, the consequences could be severe. And if I'm right," Zarathul replied, "we might learn something that changes us for the better." Standing alone in the empty chamber, Zarathul felt the weight of her decision. In 3 days, the first official Vextai diplomatic mission would depart for Earth. The future of both species now hung in the balance, dependent on whether her people could learn to see strength in kindness and wisdom in compassion. She touched the place where Jack's careful stitches had once held her wing together. The repairs were long healed now, but the memory of his gentle hands and patient care remained as vivid as ever. Whatever happened next, she would not let his sacrifice be meaningless. 6 months later, the Vextai diplomatic vessel Honors Edge entered Earth's solar system, broadcasting peaceful intentions on all frequencies. The response from humanity was everything Zarathul had hoped for and feared: immediate military mobilization coupled with desperate attempts at communication. Zarathul stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the blue-white marble of Earth grow larger on the main screen. Beside her, Ambassador Velare and General Koyastan represented the 2 factions that had emerged within her delegation: those who believed in her vision of human potential, and those who remained convinced that this mission was an elaborate mistake. Empress Communications Officer Dexmar reported, "We're receiving hundreds of transmission on different frequencies. Mathematical sequences, music, images, what appears to be every human language. They're trying everything they can think of to talk to us." "And their military response?" General KYS-10 asked. "Every armed vessel they possess is moving to intercept us, but they're maintaining defensive positions. No aggressive maneuvering or weapons targeting. It's as if they're prepared to fight, but hoping they won't have to." Zarathul nodded. It was exactly what she had predicted. Humans prepared to defend their world, but desperate to find a peaceful solution. "Open channel. Use the linguistic database I compiled." The main screen shifted to show a conference room where dozens of humans in formal attire had gathered. She recognized the setting from intelligence reports: the United Nations, humanity's attempt at global cooperation. At the center of the group sat a middle-aged woman whose calm expression couldn't quite hide her fear. "People of Earth," Zarathul began, speaking in careful English, "I am Empress Zarathul of the Vextai Empire. I come not as a conqueror, but as someone who owes a debt to your species." The reaction in the UN chamber was immediate: gasps, frantic whispered conversations, and more than a few people reaching for communication devices. The woman at the center raised her hand for silence. "I am Secretary General Chun," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "On behalf of humanity, I welcome you to our solar system. May I ask the nature of this debt you mention?" Zarathul had rehearsed this moment countless times, but actually seeing human faces, real people, not intelligence reports or tactical assessments, made it more difficult than she had expected. 7 months ago, I crashed on your world. I was injured and dying. One of your people, a man named Jackson Patterson, spent 3 days caring for my injuries without knowing anything about me except that I needed help. He asked for nothing in return. He expected nothing in return. He helped me simply because it was the right thing to do. The reaction in the UN chamber was electric. Secretary General Chen's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "Jack Chun Patterson," she said slowly, "is my nephew." The coincidence was so incredible that for a moment Zarathul wondered if some cosmic force was orchestrating events. Then she remembered Jack's quiet strength and realized that perhaps the universe had simply led her to exactly the right human at exactly the right time. "Your nephew saved my life," Zarathul continued, "and in doing so, he showed me something that doesn't exist in my civilization. I have come here to offer humanity something that has never been offered to a pre-spaceflight species: full membership in the galactic community. The chamber erupted in chaos. Voices rose in dozens of languages as the implications sank in. Secretary General Chun called for order, but it took several minutes for the noise to subside. "Empress," she finally said, "while we are honored by your offer, I must ask, what does this membership entail? What would you expect from us in return?" It was the question Zarathul had been dreading, because the honest answer challenged everything her people believed about interspecies relationships. "We expect nothing," she said. "We offer protection from hostile species, access to beneficial technologies, and inclusion in galactic trade networks. In return, we ask only that you remain who you are." Ambassador Villarreal shifted uncomfortably beside her. Even among her supporters, the concept of giving without receiving was difficult to accept. "I don't understand," Secretary General Chen replied. "Surely there must be some benefit you seek. Resources, territory, technological knowledge. You have already given us the only thing we need," Zarathul said. "You have shown us that intelligence can develop alongside compassion, that strength can exist without domination, that advanced civilizations can choose kindness over conquest. That lesson is worth more than all the resources in your solar system." General Kawais-10 stepped forward, his skepticism finally boiling over. "Empress, with respect, this is absurd. These beings cannot offer us anything meaningful. Their technology is primitive, their military is non-existent, their political systems are chaotic. What you're proposing violates every principle of imperial expansion." Zarathul turned to face him, and, in that moment, everyone watching, both human and Vextai, saw not just an empress, but someone who had been fundamentally changed by her encounter with humanity. "General," she said quietly, "you're absolutely right. This violates every principle we've followed for 3,000 years. Those principles have given us an empire that spans half the galaxy. They have also given us a civilization where kindness is weakness, where compassion is manipulation, where helping others is seen as a character flaw." She turned back to the human delegation, many of whom were now listening with tears in their eyes. "My people are stronger than yours in every measurable way. We have conquered species more advanced than humanity will be for centuries. But we have never learned to do what Jack did for me, to help someone simply because they needed help. That is a strength we cannot conquer, cannot steal, and cannot replicate. We can only learn it." Secretary General Chun leaned forward, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was being offered. "You want us to teach you?" she asked. "I want you to be yourselves," Zarathul replied. "I want you to remain a species that produces people like Jack. And I want my people to learn that there are kinds of strength that have nothing to do with weapons or technology or political power." The silence that followed was broken by a new voice from the human delegation, an older man with graying hair and kind eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, standing slowly, "my name is Jack Chin Patterson. I believe we've met." The recognition hit Zarathul like a physical blow. Older, wearing formal clothes instead of hiking gear, but unmistakably the same gentle eyes and patient smile that had watched over her for 3 days in a forest clearing. "Jack," she breathed, and, without thinking about protocol or dignity or the watching millions on both worlds, she stepped down from her command platform and walked toward the screen. "I told you I would find a way to repay what you did for me," she said, switching to the mixture of languages they had developed during their time together. Jack smiled that same warm, accepting smile. "You didn't owe me anything then, and you don't owe me anything now. But I'm glad you're okay." And there it was, the fundamental difference between their species encapsulated in a single exchange. Zarathul saw debt where Jack saw simple human decency. She saw obligation where he saw choice. She saw transaction where he saw relationship. "Perhaps," she said, speaking to both the human delegation and her own crew, "we can learn from each other." The formal negotiations that followed took weeks, but the real decision was made in that moment. Humanity would join the galactic community not as subjects or allies, but as teachers. And the Vextai Empire would begin the long, difficult process of learning that true strength sometimes meant having the courage to be kind. Years later, when historians studied the moment that changed the course of galactic civilization, they would point to elaborate political and economic factors. They would analyze the strategic benefits of the human alliance and the technological advantages of peaceful cooperation. But Zarathul knew the truth was simpler. Sometimes the most profound changes in the universe began with one person deciding to help another, asking nothing in return except the chance to ease someone else's pain. Jack had healed more than her wings that night in the forest. He had shown her that there were ways of being strong that her people had never imagined, and that the greatest empires were built not on conquest, but on the simple recognition that all beings deserve compassion. The alien queen finally understood why he had helped her, and, in understanding, had learned that the question itself revealed everything her people still needed to learn about what it truly meant to be civilized.